Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. Podcast on music and philosophy by Lodewijk Muns. Episode 1. How durable is classical music? Some 5 billion years, then the sun will burn out. Much sooner, I suppose, our planet will cease to exist. It is still an unimaginable time span, and most likely beyond the existence of anything that we might recognize as human. So, nothing to worry about. And yet, intuitively and irrationally, the thought does worry me sometimes. It's easier to accept one's own individual finiteness than that of mankind. And it's easier to accept that of mankind, in the very long run, than that of music. Mozart should be forever and ever. Beauty should last forever, but cannot, because without us there is no such experience. And maybe not even with us, in a shorter while. Maybe one of the Voyager space probes, launched in 1977, will survive humanity, wiped out by its own blunderous mismanagement. Maybe an alien space traveler will be lucky enough to stumble upon it and to figure out how to play its golden record of sounds from Earth. Listening to the Queen of the Night's aria from the magic flute, supposing his physiology allows that, he, or she, or it might be startled, amused, or confused. But it is unlikely that there will be any correspondence between its perceptions and what his music was meant to achieve. The alien listener couldn't have a clue that this is a portrayal of an evil fairy tale queen on the verge of hysteria. Hell's vengeance seethes in my heart. In a musical play, would it have the concept that uniquely blends popular and learned style elements with elite Masonic symbolism? Is that necessary to understand this aria? My short answer is yes. My long answer is this podcast series, Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. A young human being somewhere on this planet who happens to be zapping through Spotify at this moment and hits upon Voyager's playlist might be in a somewhat similar situation as the alien. Of course, she would know what human female voices sound like ordinarily, and she might have enough intuitive familiarity with tonal harmony to follow the basic musical patterns. She might even recognize the music's expression of frenzied rage, although the compilers of Voyager's hit parade seem to have missed that altogether. The Queen's Vengeance aria makes an odd pairing with spoken messages like "We have goodwill towards you and spread peace across space."
Bonam erga vos voluntatem habemus, et pacem per astra ferimus.
تحياتنا للأصدقاء في النجوم يا ليت يجمعنا الزمان.
Selamat malam hadirin sekalian, selamat berpisah dan sampai bertemu lagi di lain waktu.
Beauty, to me, that word is just a stopgap for everything we can experience as what makes music valuable. That includes being emotionally moved, feelings of awe, joy, and humor. Such values are not a timeless given. They are largely historically and culturally determined and require a familiarity with style and context that has grown over time. European music of the past few centuries has increasingly drawn upon musical and cultural memories acquired by the listeners and embedded in the music itself. And since a far-reaching memory and long-standing familiarity are at odds with contemporary patterns of musical behavior, the burnout of Mozart and the extinction of classical music are a more pressing issue than that of the sun. Nowhere near as urgent as the catastrophe that is taking place in the natural world. In this context, everything else can seem pointless, including talking about music. Perhaps it would be better if there were a great cultural strike, if all music were silenced, all theaters closed, all televisions turned black, because we should focus on one thing only, on the colossal revolution needed to put the brakes on the catastrophe. But that strike will not happen, so I just keep talking and believing that there is a connection between one and the other, cultural loss and climate change. That connection lies in consumer behavior. Disposable packaging, disposable clothing, and disposable music are part of the same consumption pattern. The biggest obstacle to more profound musical experiences is living in a limited present. It is a paradox of today's unprecedented flow of information that with ever-increasing volume it simultaneously breeds tunnel vision and tunnel listening. For countless people, every approach to the internet passes through the filter of the constricting and self-affirming algorithms of the so-called social media. In fact, these are just social platforms. The actual medium is the internet, and the internet as a whole, with its rapidly increasing wells of digitized source material, offers unprecedented opportunities to dive deeper rather than fishing for ready-made answers. This is a daily miracle for someone who, like me, grew up with only paper sources and typewriters. Therefore, the acceleration and broadening of the flow of information does not necessarily lead to superficiality. It also offers opportunities to go deeper. Faster can be deeper. Classical music, that is a term used without much thought, as if it were obvious what we mean by that. But it is a vague concept that invariably provokes misunderstandings. What do we call classical music? Significantly, the most comprehensive and authoritative music encyclopedia, the so-called New Grove, ducks its responsibility when it comes to defining classical music. We do find the term in articles on popular music. The distinction made in common parlance between classical music and popular music is described as a contrast of art music versus entertainment, of simple music versus complex music, and, even more dubiously, as the music of an elite versus that of the people in a broad sense. Popular music would thus be a derogatory term. Of course, it just depends on whose parlance you are trying to analyze, but that popular music would be a derogatory term, that is a rather bizarre idea in a world where most popular is the first commandment. Almost as problematic is the characterization of classical music as art music, complex and elitist. If classical music were complex by definition, there would be no simple classical music. We do not call a Mozart Minuet less classical because it is simple. We might hesitate to call it art music if it is intended for dancing or as practice material rather than for listening. Associated with the concept of elite are implications of social class and privilege. But the idea that with rising social status and capital, musical taste would tend more towards the classical is as baseless as the old adage that classical music would be age-related. Pop for the youngsters, classical for the oldies. Yet we cannot ignore the fact that classical music is of European origin, that its sponsors, patrons, listeners, amateur musicians, in most cases belonged to a social elite, the nobility and the wealthy bourgeoisie, and also that the global dissemination of classical music is a consequence of the colonial system. If Mozart is played today in Sydney, Jakarta, Cape Town and Sao Paulo, it is because Mozart reached these continents as part of European colonial culture. The key to what makes classical music, I think, must be sought in its history. Many phenomena we cannot understand without tracing how they evolved. We can therefore look for the identity of classical music in a historical continuity within musical practice. It is linked to certain musical practices and institutions which are historically closely connected to the so-called classical style, dating from about 1770 to 1820, the time of Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven, and to its uninterrupted cultivation in the repertoire. That repertoire has continually expanded with new music up to the present day, new music which can be called classical to the extent that it builds upon that tradition. The concept has also expanded backwards to include the 17th century Baroque. This almost exclusively involves composed music, music written down in the form of a score, which can be performed by any competent musician. Performances are therefore almost always covers in the jargon of popular music. Included in the tradition are the musical instruments, the symphony orchestra, public concerts in purpose-built concert halls, and professional music training in conservatoires. Classical instruments and classical singing and playing techniques were developed long before the electronic age, specifically to fill small and later increasingly larger concert halls and opera houses. For popular genres, electric amplification has been a defining feature since the 1930s. The pop or jazz singer can whisper and still be heard above a loud ensemble. For some genres, pure volume has even become the most important musical parameter, the strongest means of producing an effect on the listener. Classical music carries the burden and riches of an accumulated past. Since the end of the 18th century, much of the repertoire has retained its place in concert practice, and we still play and listen to Bach, Beethoven, Schumann, Mahler, and so on. Something that was not customary for older music in Bach's time, but became standard in the 19th century. Older music was also increasingly a source of inspiration and a reference for new music. This led to increasing complexity, and not necessarily in the structure of the notes, but in the wealth of associative meaning. Listening to Mahler without knowing Beethoven is like reading War and Peace and never having heard of Napoleon. Therefore, one of the joys and pleasures of classical music is a lifelong exploration of the unknown and the re-exploration of the known in the light of new experiences. A nostalgic listener can find consolation and affirmation in classical music, a kind of comfortable domesticity. That is one of its lesser virtues. It is not what determines its social-cultural value, and that which deserves to be defended against market fetishism and cultural relativism. That lies in the opportunities it offers us to escape from the tunnels. This was the first episode of Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. Sources for music and text can be found in the show notes.